My name is Emma Lawrence, and the first thing you should know about me is that I was raised to be useful, not loved. That distinction didn't fully make sense to me until the morning my life cracked open, quietly, without drama. In a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, I was 32 years old, wearing a navy blazer I'd bought on clearance, sitting across from three executives who were thanking me for everything I'd done while sliding in termination packet across the table. I had helped build that company from a shaky startup into something stable. I trained half the team. I fixed mistakes that weren't mine. And still, when the merger happened, I was redundant. I walked out with a cardboard box and a numb smile, already rehearsing how I'd explain it to my family, how I'd soften it so it didn't sound like failure. What I didn't know yet was that losing my job wasn't the betrayal. It was just the opening scene. I drove straight to my parents' house in Naperville because that's what I'd always done when something went wrong. My mother, Carol Lawrence, had a talent for making disappointment feel like a moral flaw. My father, Richard, believed love was measured in how impressive you looked to other people. When I told them I'd been laid off, my mom sighed like I'd spilled red wine on a white couch. "After everything we've invested in you," she said. Not "we're sorry," not "are you okay," invested. My younger brother, Mark, golden and callous, didn't even look up from his phone. By dinner, the conversation had shifted seamlessly to him, his new business idea, his need for a loan, how I could probably help with the numbers now that I had free time. That was when it landed. I wasn't a daughter. I was infrastructure. The truth is, I had been quietly holding that family together for years. I managed my parents' rental properties, handled their taxes, cleaned up Mark's credit messes, co-signed loans I pretended not to worry about. When my father's health scare threatened their insurance, I fixed it. When my mother's boutique bled money, I covered gaps and called it temporary. They liked to joke that I was the responsible one, but responsibility is just another word for unpaid labor when love is conditional. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with the glow in the dark stars still stuck to the ceiling, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. 2 weeks later, I found out they'd listed one of the properties for sale without telling me. The same property I was financially tied to. The same one they planned to sell to fund Mark's latest dream. I stared at the email. Confirmation forwarded accidentally by their realtor and realized something important. Everyone assumed I would keep saving them forever. They assumed I'd swallow it again, sitting there on that old bed, surrounded by trophies that never really belonged to me. I made a decision I hadn't known I was allowed to make. I stopped asking how to be useful. I started asking what would happen if I wasn't. The shift didn't happen loudly. There was no slammed door, no dramatic speech where I announced I was done. That would have been too easy for them, too clean. Instead, I did something far more unsettling for people like my parents and my brother. I went quiet. I stopped answering immediately. I stopped volunteering solutions. When my mother called to complain about the realtor needing updated financials, I told her I'd get to it when I could. When Mark texted asking if I could co-sign, just one more thing. I left the message on read. Silence, I learned, was not absence. It was a mirror. And they hated what it reflected. With my severance and a small emergency fund I'd built in secret, I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Evanston, close to the lake. It wasn't glamorous. The floors creaked, the heat was unreliable, and the view was mostly brick. But it was mine. For the first time in my adult life, no one had a spare key. No one could walk in and demand access to my time or my brain. I took contract work and sexy, spreadsheet heavy, consulting gigs that paid steadily and asked nothing about my family name. The relief of being valued only for my work, not my willingness to sacrifice myself, was intoxicating. That's when the cracks started showing back home. Without me smoothing things over, small problems grew teeth. A late payment turned into a penalty. A missed form triggered an audit. My mother called one evening, her voice sharp with panic, asking if I'd forgotten to renew a permit for one of the rentals. I hadn't forgotten. I'd just stopped doing things I was never thanked for. "You're the one managing it now," I said calmly. "You'll need to handle that." There was a long pause, followed by a brittle laugh. "Emma, don't be difficult." Difficult, the word she used whenever I stepped out of line. A week later, my father showed up unannounced at my apartment. He looked older than I remembered, his confidence thinner without the armor of control. He sat on my couch and launched into a speech about family obligation, about how everyone had a role, about how Mark just needed support to find his footing. I listened, really listened, and noticed something new. He never once asked how I was doing. Not about the layoff, not about the move, not about me. When he finished, he waited, expecting reassurance, expecting me to fold. Instead, I said, "I'm not available to fix this anymore." My voice didn't shake. His did. What I didn't tell him and what none of them knew yet was that I'd already taken steps they couldn't undo. I'd met with a lawyer. I'd disentangled myself from shared accounts, withdrawn my name from liabilities that had never benefited me. I'd learned line by line exactly how exposed they were without me, and for the first time, I didn't rush to protect them from that knowledge. I let it sit, like a storm gathering offshore. They still thought this was a phase, a sulk. They believed I'd come back once the fear of independence wore off. They were wrong. The first real panic call came on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in line for coffee, rain dripping from my coat onto the tile. My phone buzzed with Mark's name, followed by 3 missed calls in under a minute. When I finally answered, he didn't bother with hello. "Emma, what the hell did you do?" he snapped. In the background, I could hear voices, tense, overlapping. The sound of people who just realized the ground wasn't as solid as they thought. He told me the bank had frozen the credit line tied to the rental properties. Said the loan officer wanted updated documentation and confirmation of guarantors. Translation: my quiet withdrawal had been noticed. I took a sip of my coffee and said I didn't do anything. I just stopped doing things I wasn't legally obligated to do. He laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "You can't just opt out of family." I almost smiled. "Watch me." By the end of that week, the tone changed. My mother called, not angry now, but wounded. She told me she didn't sleep, that my father's blood pressure was up, that this stress was killing them. It was a masterclass in emotional leverage, one I'd sat through my entire life. But something in me had shifted. I heard the words without absorbing the blame. "You raised me to be responsible," I said. "I'm being responsible for myself." She cried then. Real tears, or maybe just well-practiced ones. Either way, I didn't rush to soothe her. That was new, and it scared her more than any raised voice ever could. Around the same time, I got an unexpected email from a woman named Denise Harper, a regional operations director for a property management firm. I'd once quietly helped during a temporary consulting favor. She'd heard through a mutual contact that I was available. "We're expanding," she wrote, "and we could use someone who understands both the financial and human side of the business." The interview felt surreal. No one asked what my family did. No one assumed I'd clean up someone else's mess for free. 2 weeks later, I signed an offer that paid more than my old job, with equity on top. I didn't tell my parents. That silence was intentional, because while my life was stabilizing, theirs was unraveling. Mark's business idea collapsed without funding. One of the rental units failed inspection, triggering fines they hadn't budgeted for. Vendors who'd extended goodwill for years suddenly wanted cash up front. Every problem they'd handed to me like an inconvenience now landed squarely in their laps. They started calling more often, then less, adjusting their strategy like gamblers who'd lost their lucky charm. Guilt didn't work. Anger didn't work. So they tried nostalgia. My father sent me an old photo of the 3 of us at a county fair. Me on his shoulders, cotton candy stuck to my hair. "Remember when we were close?" he texted. I stared at the picture for a long time. I remembered that day. I also remembered how, later that same year, he'd told me not to apply to an out-of-state college because it would be inconvenient for the family. Love, I realized, had always come with conditions. I didn't reply. What they still didn't understand was that this wasn't revenge fueled by rage. It was something colder and more precise. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was letting the systems they'd built finally operate, without my unpaid labor propping them up. And once those systems started failing, there was no speech or apology that could rewind time. There was only consequence. The real breaking point came a month later, wrapped in the thinnest disguise of reconciliation. My mother invited me to dinner, just the three of us, saying she wanted to clear the air. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Part of me still wanted proof that I mattered outside of what I could provide. I arrived at their house to find the table set formally, candles lit like it was a holiday. My father poured wine with shaking hands. Mark was already there, unusually quiet. His confidence replaced by something tight and desperate. I knew then this wasn't about healing. It was a negotiation. They started carefully, complimenting my new job, news travels. Fast when money is involved. About my apartment, my schedule. Then my mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. A gesture she hadn't used since I was a teenager. "We're proud of you," she said. My chest tightened. Then came the pivot. She talked about how hard things had been without me, how the family business was suffering, how Mark was learning responsibility but still needed guidance. My father added that mistakes had been made on all sides, but families move forward together. When Mark finally spoke, it was rehearsed. He needed a bridge loan. Just temporary. Just until things stabilized. He looked at me like I was oxygen. I pulled my hand back gently. "No," I said. The word landed heavy on the table. My mother blinked, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "Emma, don't be like this," she said softly, which was somehow worse. "We're offering you your place back. We'll put things in writing, titles, authority, respect." Respect, offered only after leverage was lost, felt almost insulting. I looked around the table and realized something painful but freeing. None of them were asking how to make things right with me. They were asking how to make me useful again. When I stood to leave, my father's voice cracked. "If you walk away now," he said, "don't expect things to be the same. They already aren't." Mark exploded then, accusing me of abandonment, of thinking I was better than them. He said I'd changed, like that was an accusation. I didn't argue. I paid my share of the meal and walked out into the cold night. My hands shaking, my heart strangely light. The consequences came faster after that. Without my financial backing, the bank called in a loan. One of the properties went into foreclosure proceedings. My parents tried to refinance and were denied. Mark moved back home, his independence officially over. Neighbors started whispering. The image my parents curated so carefully began to fray. Invitations slowed. People who once laughed at their jokes now asked pointed questions about cash flow and stability. Status is fragile when it isn't earned honestly. Meanwhile, my life grew quieter, sturdier. I spent evenings walking by the lake, the wind sharp and honest. I furnished my apartment slowly, choosing things because I liked them, not because they impressed anyone. At work, my opinion carried weight. When problems arose, they were solved collaboratively, not dumped on the nearest compliant person. I slept better than I ever had. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived from a law firm representing my parents, full of vague threats and dramatic language. My lawyer read it and laughed. "They're bluffing," she said, "and they're scared." I felt no rush of victory, only confirmation. The power I'd been giving away wasn't gone. It had simply returned to its rightful owner, and they were finally realizing what life looked like without it. If you want to understand how deeply people rely on you, stop saving them and watch how fast they start calling it betrayal. That realization settled in fully the day my mother showed up at my office unannounced. She somehow found the building, the floor, the reception desk, all without calling me first. When the receptionist buzzed to say, "Your mother is here," my stomach dropped not from fear, but from a strange sense of inevitability. I stepped into the lobby and saw Carol Lawrence standing there, impeccably dressed, eyes already glassy. She looked smaller than I remembered, like someone who lost the spotlight and didn't know where to stand. She didn't waste time. "We're drowning," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Your father won't admit it, but, things are bad. The bank is watching us." Mark as depressed. "People are talking." She looked around the lobby like the walls themselves might judge her. "You can fix this. You always do." There it was. "Not, please. Not, I'm sorry." Just assumption. I took a breath and told her calmly that I couldn't talk at work. We walked outside, the city noise swallowing the tension for a moment. She tried a new tactic then. Vulnerability. She talked about sacrifices, about the pressure she'd felt to keep up appearances, about how she leaned on me because I was stronger than the rest. I listened, really listened, and felt compassion without obligation for the first time. "Being strong doesn't mean being used," I said. Her face tightened. "So you're just going to let us fail?" she asked. I met her gaze. "I'm letting you handle your own life." She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. The fallout was swift and public. One of the rental properties sold at a loss. A local business journal published a short piece about financial restructuring. In my parents' portfolio, it wasn't scandalous, but it was enough. Their peers noticed. The whispers turned into distance. Mark stopped calling altogether, and when he did, it was to accuse me of ruining everything. I stopped explaining myself. Explanations are wasted on people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Then, unexpectedly, something beautiful happened. I received a letter from my aunt, my mother's sister, the quiet one no one paid attention to. She wrote that she'd watched me carry the family for years and was proud of me for choosing myself. She said she wished she'd had the courage to do the same. I cried reading that letter, not from pain, but from validation. One person seeing you clearly can undo years of gaslighting. At work, I was promoted. At home, my apartment began to feel like a sanctuary. I adopted a rescue dog named Milo, who slept curled against my legs and reminded me daily that loyalty doesn't demand self-destruction. And somewhere in the background of my life, my family continued to struggle, not because I attacked them, but because I stopped shielding them. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't cruel. I was finished. The revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't explosive. It was quiet, steady, and rooted in self-respect. And as my parents' carefully built image crumbled, mine was finally, deliberately, being built for real. By the 6th month, the distance between who I used to be and who I was becoming felt almost unreal. The old version of me would have been tracking my parents' problems like a second job, waiting for the moment they collapsed so I could rush in and save them. This version of me heard updates the way you hear weather, reports in another state briefly, without urgency. I found out through a former neighbor that my parents had put the house on the market quietly, hoping to downsize before anyone noticed they were being forced to. Mark had taken a job at a logistics warehouse on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the entrepreneur he liked to brag about being. None of this made me smile. It didn't make me cry either. It just was. The strangest part was how my parents tried to rewrite the narrative. Suddenly, according to extended family, I was the one who had changed, who had become cold, career-obsessed, ungrateful. My mother told people she didn't recognize me anymore, that success had gone to my head. It was almost impressive how quickly they reframed my boundaries as cruelty. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Late at night, lying in bed, with Milo breathing softly beside me, I wondered if I really had gone too far. Then I remembered the dinner table negotiations, the unannounced office visits, the complete absence of accountability. Doubt faded. One evening my father called. It was the first time he'd reached out directly in months. His voice sounded tired, stripped of authority. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just said, "I don't know how to fix this." For years, that sentence would have pulled me right back into place. This time, I answered honestly. "Neither do I," I said. and I meant it. Their mess was no longer my puzzle to solve. He was quiet for a long time, then hung up. That was it. No apology. No breakthrough. Just the sound of a door closing on a chapter that had already ended for me. Meanwhile, my own life kept expanding in ways that felt almost undeserved. After so many years of constriction, I was invited to speak on a small industry panel, something my parents would have bragged about endlessly if it benefited them. I didn't tell them. I started dating again casually, choosing people who asked questions and listened to the answers. I traveled for the first time without checking in, spent money without guilt, rested without justification. These things sound small, but when you've lived as emotional infrastructure your whole life, freedom is built from details. The final shift came the day I realized I no longer felt the urge to explain myself to anyone, not my family, not mutual acquaintances fishing for drama, not even the part of me that had been trained to self-interrogate. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply stepped out of a role that was killing me slowly. If their world couldn't survive without my constant sacrifice, then it had never been stable to begin with. And in that quiet truth, there was no bitterness left, only relief. The moment that finally sealed everything didn't come with shouting or tears. It came in the form of a small envelope forwarded to my new address. My name typed neatly on the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. Inside was a copy of a revised will, my parents' will. Tucked beneath it was a short note from my mother. We've had to make some adjustments given recent events. I hope you understand. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling the weight of what wasn't said. The message was clear. This was leverage. One last attempt to remind me that love in our family had always been transactional. Stay in line, stay included. Step away and you're written out. Old me would have spiraled. I would have wondered what I'd done wrong, how to fix it, whether I should reach out and smooth things over before it was too late. Instead, I felt something close to amusement. They still thought the threat of loss controlled me. They didn't understand that I'd already grieved the version of them that loved me without conditions. Whatever inheritance they were dangling had been paid for many times over with my labor, my credit, my peace. I placed the papers back in the envelope and slid it into a drawer without responding. A week later, I ran into Mark by accident at a grocery store near my apartment. He looked thinner, older somehow, the bravado gone. We stood there awkwardly between the produce and the freezer aisle. Two people who shared a childhood and almost nothing else. He tried to joke, asked if I was still mad. I told him I wasn't mad. That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. "Mom says you did this to teach us a lesson," he said. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "I did this so I could survive." He didn't have an answer for that. That night, I went home and sat on the floor with Milo, my back against the couch, thinking about how many times I'd shrunk myself to keep others comfortable, how often I'd mistaken endurance for love. I realized that walking away hadn't just changed my relationship with my family, it had changed my relationship with myself. I trusted my instincts now. I believed my own memories. I no longer needed someone else to validate that what I'd experienced was real. From a distance, I could see my parents adapting, the way people do when denial finally runs out. A smaller house, fewer appearances, a quieter life they'd never planned for. Maybe one day they'd understand. Maybe they wouldn't. That question no longer lived rent-free in my head. Healing, I learned, doesn't require closure from the people who hurt you. Sometimes, it just requires enough space to hear your own voice again. I wasn't celebrated for my decision. There was no apology tour, no dramatic reconciliation. But there was peace. There was a life built on consent instead of obligation. And standing there in my small, imperfect apartment, with a rescue dog at my feet and a future that belonged entirely to me, I knew something with absolute certainty. Walking away hadn't made me less of a daughter. It had made me whole. Life has a strange way of testing your resolve right after you think you've found your footing. For me, that test came nearly a year after everything fell apart. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, when my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. My father. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the old reflex twitching in my chest, the instinct to brace myself, to prepare to give. I let it ring once more before answering. His voice was softer than I remembered, stripped of the authority that once filled entire rooms. He told me my mother had been hospitalized overnight, not anything dramatic, just exhaustion, stress, a warning from her doctor that she couldn't keep living the way she had been. He didn't ask me to come home. Not directly. He just said, "She keeps asking for you." After I hung up, I sat there in silence, the weight of choice pressing in on me. This was the moment people talk about when they say, "But what if something happens?" The guilt crept in, familiar and sharp. I imagined walking into that hospital room, imagined my mother's eyes searching my face for reassurance, imagined myself slipping back into the role she needed me to play. And then I imagined what would happen. After how quickly concern would turn into expectation, how a single step back would be treated as permission to reclaim everything I'd fought to protect. I understood then that boundaries aren't proven when things are easy. They're proven when you're tempted to break them. I didn't go. Instead, I sent a short message wishing her a smooth recovery and telling my father I hope she listened to her doctors. It wasn't cold, it was honest. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking along the lake, the air crisp, Milo tugging gently at his leash. I felt sad, yes, but I didn't feel wrong, and that mattered more than anything. In the weeks that followed, the world kept moving forward. I signed the lease on a slightly bigger place, one with more light, and a small balcony where I could drink my coffee in the mornings. I took on a leadership role at work, mentoring younger employees who reminded me of myself capable, eager, and dangerously willing to overextend for approval. I made a point of teaching them something no one had taught me, that being valuable doesn't mean being expendable. I heard through the grapevine that my parents had started telling people they were proud of me now, that I was independent and strong. It was easier for them to rewrite the story than to apologize. That was fine. The version of me they talked about in rooms I wasn't in no longer defined me. One night, sitting on my balcony under a string of cheap lights, I realized something quietly profound. The revenge everyone expects, the yelling, the public downfall, the dramatic confrontation had never been the point. The real revenge was living a life so steady, so self-directed that their approval became irrelevant. They had taught me, accidentally, exactly how not to love, and I had used that lesson to build something better. I didn't win by destroying them. I won by refusing to destroy myself anymore. Months passed, and the quiet power of my choice became almost imperceptible to everyone but me. My parents' world had slowly recalibrated without me as its keystone. Their business continued, but more cautiously, less flamboyantly, and every time a mistake surfaced, they felt it as sharply as I once had. Mark stopped calling entirely, moving into an apartment far from their orbit, humbled by the first real consequences he had ever faced. My mother and father learned to navigate life without automatic rescues, and in that, they discovered the limits of control they'd always assumed were theirs. For the first time in my life, I was no longer responsible for their illusions. Meanwhile, my own life flourished in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. Danny and I settled into our home in Evanston, filling it with small joys instead of appearances. I planted a garden, crooked but thriving, and every morning, sunlight poured across the living room, illuminating a space that was ours alone. I took on more consulting projects, not out of obligation, but for the satisfaction of solving problems that didn't carry emotional strings. I laughed more easily, ate breakfast without checking a ledger, and went to sleep without the faint hum of dread in my chest. There were no calls in the middle of the night, no panicked texts demanding I'd fix what wasn't mine to fix. For the first time, I had full dominion over my own life. Sometimes, when I walked through the city streets or along the lakeshore, I imagined my parents noticing my absence, and realizing that nothing was being held together by me anymore. I didn't hope for remorse. I didn't wait for apologies. I only observed how their carefully constructed control had crumbled quietly. And in that silence, I felt an extraordinary sense of justice, not revenge in the melodramatic sense, but the sober consequence of stepping away from a system that never valued me as a person, only as a tool. That realization carried more weight than any confrontation ever could, and the moments of triumph weren't loud. They were small, domestic, and deeply satisfying. Danny and I hosting friends in our tiny apartment, everyone eating messy sandwiches and laughing until their cheeks hurt. Milo sleeping at my feet while I poured coffee, the city waking around us, receiving an email from a client thanking me for work that felt meaningful, rather than work that rescued someone else from their own mismanagement. These were the victories that didn't require validation from anyone else. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat on the balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon. The wind stirred the leaves of the small trees lining the street, and I realized I didn't carry the weight of my family's expectations anymore. I didn't need their recognition, their approval, or their presence to feel complete. I had built my own world. One where loyalty was mutual, respect was unconditional, and love didn't require erasure of self. My parents had given me the blueprint of control, and I had turned it into freedom. Walking away had been the hardest choice of my life, but it was also the most liberating. I had learned that the bravest form of revenge is not destruction. It's survival, self-respect, and the courage to finally live for yourself. Emma Lawrence, who once carried everyone else's life in her hands, now carried only her own, and that, I realized, was more than enough.